first of all, thank you for asking me to be part of this interview session. I'm Edith Sullivan, and I'm a professor at Stanford University School of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences.
How did you move along your path in alcohol research? And I mean, some people find influences even in their adolescence or childhood. How did you move along your path, and were there people along the way that had a special impact on your route to becoming a scientist?
Absolutely. Oh, let's see. I should to start with alcohol. Okay, that my alcohol research began with and because of Pfefferbaum. When I moved from, in fact, when my family and I moved from Massachusetts to California in 1987, I was looking for a position because I didn't move myself. It was my husband who had gotten a job at Apple, and he was made an offer he couldn't refuse. And so, we had long discussions about it. And I said, sounds good to me. We always grow when we move. So I sent out my resume to a number of different universities and places around. And this is an interesting story that I won't get into right now. But I ended up interviewing with Dolph Pfefferbaum, and I was really lucky that he said he didn't have a full-time position for me, but he did have part-time, and I said that's perfect because my kids were in high school. And in my experience, if I had had a part-time position, it always grew into a full-time position. So I wasn't at all concerned about that. So he was the director of the MHCRC at the Palo Alto VA, and also had an alcohol grant, which is now, I think, in its 37th year, which is about the same length of time that I've been at Stanford too. So my research at in Dolph's laboratory started off with both schizophrenia and alcohol use disorder, which was called alcoholism at that time. So that's how I initiated any work in alcohol. But there's a little bit of a backstory too, and not that I had any personal interest per se in alcohol, but I have had it with neuropsychology. Okay, and my experimental life started off in experimental psychology in my graduate and undergraduate work, and but I grew to love neuropsychology, which was kind of frowned upon in my experimental psychology classes, but I escaped.
Yeah, stop me and ask,
Yeah.
Why was it frowned upon?
Because at that time it seemed as if it was more observational than experimental. In experimental psychology, you learn how to uh, do prospective research and develop experiments that would answer a question in a causal way. Whereas with neuropsychology, at least from the parochial view of the experimental psychologist, you could only do observational work and maybe assume that a behavior was associated with a piece of the brain. So I kind of broke out of that old-fashioned concept that you had to have these experiments in order to figure out the worth of the brain as it applied to behavior. Okay, so I was lucky enough to take my experimental psychology background and bring it into the neuropsychology purview and create some interesting, homemade experiments in memory and the like in with patients with Alzheimer's disease and in Parkinson's disease and in people with global amnesia, most notably the patient HM. As I was lucky enough to be a research scientist at MIT, where we studied all of these different patient groups. Um, so, so that was a nice segue from, being kind of narrowed, but learning experimental hygiene with experimental psychology, moving into neuropsychology, recognizing that the brain actually does something for behavior, and then moving to alcohol research, which in those days in particular was really poo-pooed by the neurologists and the like because they just considered it a diffuse brain problem that everybody knows what the answer is to. I didn't even know what the question was. Um, and so I was in this new laboratory learning about schizophrenia and learning about alcohol use disorder and bringing my experimental tools there. And we were lucky enough to be in a VA setting where the different participants, the patients, the subjects of study were inpatients. And we could study them for a long time. That we could not just have an hour with them, but I could have days with them. And when I proposed a few uh, sets of tasks to do with both the schizophrenia group and the alcohol group and the controls that we could get, and Dolph would say, sure, go ahead. Fine. So I designed a 3-day protocol to do testing for both the schizophrenia group and the alcohol group. And that's how, that's just sort of how it began for the neuropsychology part. But we do brain behavior relationships. So again, I was the luckiest person in the world to be in Dolph's lab because he, along with Kelvin Lim, who we just happened to listen to this morning, he gave a beautiful lecture in AI and how it applies to how it could apply to psychiatric diseases. But Kelvin and Dolph, as I said, looked under the hood. They taught us what CT was at that time. They taught us what MRI was. And Kelvin would give lectures to us in the lab and the research assistants how to move from the frequency to the spatial domain. So we really understood how an image was made and what it was and what it wasn't and how it could be manipulated. And that's how you learn how the different protocols were developed and you got to look under the hood. So they were doing, the dolphins, Kelvin were doing all this wonderful quantitative analysis of brain images, not just looking to see what was wrong in the brain, but to see, what the different parts of the brain, how they differ with age, how they differ with disease, and they did it in a quantitative way, ultimately doing differentiation and segmentation of gray matter, white matter, and CSF. So, okay, so this was a great foundation. This is a lucky break for a neuropsychologist. He said, oh, there are numbers that you can correlate with how well or how poorly somebody's doing on the test. and so it was just a beautiful marriage of, of, of ideas and tools. And you know, in a sense, the rest is history. Um, Dolph and I were talking about the interview, with you, Graeme, and asking how many papers have we written together over the past 37 years? Well, I guess our first publication was actually in 1990, and for peer-reviewed papers, we've got 341 that I counted up. Um, and it was, talk about causal, okay? The cause was being in the right place at the right time and with the most generative person and context that I could ever have imagined. Okay, and without that context, I wouldn't have, say, the publications and the work and the body of research that you know I've been lucky enough to be part of over the past, gosh, almost 4 decades now.
A theme that I'm seeing in these conversations is the importance of having an ability to move in many in any of many possible directions, um, and to connect with people from areas that at first may not look obvious. You've managed to, and you brought a background to that connection that hadn't been made before.
Mhm.
This freedom is really important.
Yeah, it's freedom on I think the two levels. Okay, one is you bring yourself with you, and I've always thought whatever you learn is going to be useful sometime. You don't know when. It's latent learning, and all of a sudden it pops up and is useful. Okay, and that certainly happened when I moved from California from Massachusetts to California. And then the other piece of it is to be in a generative environment, and 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 that's certainly what Dolph has offered, and not just to me, but everybody who's come through his lab. He has many people who have gone on to um, really wonderful positions, or establish themselves in research and the like. That the ideal mentorship outcome. Okay? I've just never left the arena. That's all.
Well, I'm glad that you continued, so that there are as many as 341 papers impacting the field. What challenges did you face along your path?
Uh, well, there depends on which part of the path you're talking about.
Any part that you think would be helpful for people to know or interesting.
Well, I think early on, uh, very early on, okay, when I was in graduate school, that's when I had my two children, and boy, was that unpopular. In fact, I was almost thrown out of graduate school because I was pregnant, and not only once but twice. Okay, but I kind of fought through that, and it ended up that my two sons came to my Ph.D. Graduation, and they loved it because they thought I looked like Batman. And they actually remember that to this day. Uh, so I didn't have support in graduate school. I had really good colleagues, good friends, several that I'm still in almost daily touch with, through thanks to email. And my husband was very supportive. So, I mean, that was instrumental. Um, so that was one of the difficulties that I was faced with. And people, by and large, aren't faced with that now, but I hope that it maintains on that trajectory. Then a little later on, it it wasn't. It really. Let me just think about this. I had also taught at Brandeis University at the same time that I was a research scientist at MIT. And I had a wonderful relationship with, at that time, I was the chairman of the Brandeis Department of Psychology, Jim Lackner, and he was also the head of the Ashton Graybill Spatial Orientation Laboratory. And so I was lucky enough to do some experiments with them, with that laboratory in at the Johnson Space Center to do work in extraterrestrial extraterrestrial gravito-inertial environments. In other words, in zero G, doing the parabolic flights at Houston. I don't personally have any publications from there, but I did participate in some of those experiments, and that was fantastic. That was less than once in a lifetime experience.
That sounds exciting.
Yeah, it was. It was. So I mean, that was great. And it opened my eyes to physiology in ways that I hadn't really understood before. So that was another eye opener. And at the same time, I was doing some research at MIT, and some of these might have been dead ends for my career. Okay, that there wasn't an avenue for real progression the way things were laid out in the early 80s. But when I moved to California, again, doors opened up. And again, thanks to Dolph, because he pushed any of his people who were in the lab, were at my level and beyond, to get a faculty position. And it, without that pushing, especially in those days, I don't know that I would have happened. So that you get a faculty position, and then you have to write a grant, and then you really get into it. Then you say, "Ready, go."
Mm-hmm. So I'm hearing another theme in there, which some other colleagues have said, how important it is to keep your mind open to possibilities. I see you've done that professionally, you've done that personally.
Mm-hmm.
And another theme seems to be we all have a certain amount of influence or power, some more than others, but to use what we have to help other people and open doors. Sounds like that has happened with you and by you.
Yeah. Well, you hope that if you've gotten something, that you can also give it to the next generation.
Yeah.
And that's the mantra of the lab. And once you're in the lab, you're in the family. And I'm sorry, you can't get rid of us, and we can't get rid of you. And I think that's it's a family with generations. I've been lucky too because of RSA. I've gone to RSA every year since, I don't know, at least the past 20 years, maybe longer. I kind of lost count when I started. But the people here are a family. These are our cousins. Okay, if they're not our brothers and sisters, they're at least our cousins. And the family goes beyond brain imaging or neuropsychology. Well, we all kind of are sort of in silos, as they say. RSA is an avenue to broaden your purview to really understand the sociology that's involved with alcohol use disorder, with the genetics, with the new ways to analyze the data, and just to expand everything, but in a very acceptable, friendly way for your new learning. And not that it's not competitive. I mean, you better be competitive, otherwise, you might fall asleep at the wheel. But no, RSA is the meeting I look forward to going to every year.
Me too.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, have you found that neuroimaging has affected your clinical perspectives?
Oh boy, that's an interesting question, and I would say yes. Now, recognizing that, I'll tell you that I have a clinical license, but that just happened by default, and I was grandfathered into it. And the one good thing about the old days is that if you did enough assessment under the direction of somebody else, you could kind of slip in and, and be get a clinical license if you passed all the tests. So that happened in Massachusetts. It did a million assessments on people, and I passed the test. And when I moved to California, that license was not transferable, so I had to do it again in California, but at least the hours were transferable. Okay. So, but I never used my clinical license, especially in California. I did for 1 year in Massachusetts, but I found that it just it didn't suit me. I didn't feel as if I was contributing. So, okay, that's kind of a sidebar. But when when I think in lectures that I've given on the work that we've done, I always start off about what is alcohol, what is alcoholism, or what is alcohol use disorder. And you start off with the SKID checklist. And one thing that I always point out is that actually there are 4 items in particular that are also symptoms of frontal lobe disorder. It's like persistence in wanting to drink, inability to stop thinking about drinking, and the like. And these are symptoms of frontal lobe impairment. And in our studies, we've really found that the frontal lobe is especially vulnerable to the throes of alcohol use disorder. And I do wonder whether the the what we see quantitatively with MRI and brain structure, whether that really is one of the causes of people's either inability or poor ability to resist drinking. So I've at least thought of that type of translation.
Yes.
And actually, further to that, one other thing that I've looked into, especially after one of our postdocs, and then she became one of the research scientists in the lab, and that was Anne Pascal Lebert, um, and Pascal did a couple of really interesting papers and experiments with alcohol use disordered people who were in France when she was doing her dissertation. That it sometimes it takes time for a person in recovery to take advantage of the therapy of recovery. So, in other words, it takes a little time to have the brain or the neuropsychological functions heal before you can take advantage of what you're trying to relearn. So that to me suggests that there is a real brain insult that's experiencing some recovery that's required before you can actually start taking advantage of therapy. And it goes along with some older concepts that Kurt Goldstein, who had been a neurologist and really an early behavioral neuropsychologist, who studied World War I head injured patients. And he did some in World War II as well. But one of the things he had said that when you have a brain injury, and you can have some restitution of function, but you're probably never exactly the same person as you were before. You can do some compensation that people talk about now and not talk about it. But if you compensate and take over a piece of the brain that is usually used for something else, then you've kind of horned in on that other function, so that now maybe you reduce that other function that you've now sort of semi overtaken, okay? Or perhaps you can do neither function perfectly well now. So that there's a change in behavior that has to do with the condition of the brain and whether and how much it can actually recover. And it might not always recover fully.
Right. So it sounds like there is, I've heard reason for optimism for recovery. A lot of recovery can take place, but a warning that it may not be complete.
Yeah. I'd like to think of it in terms of a stroke model. If you've had a stroke, there's something nasty that's happened to your brain, and you can, either with therapy or at least with time, you might be able to recoup some of that function. But it's probably incomplete. Mm.
Have you experienced any of those fairly rare for most of us eureka moments, and what led to them?
I know you asked about that. I don't know if I had had any eureka moments, I'll have to say. Um, uh, you know, my work has been more accruing information than it has been with having, a quantum leap. Um, I, 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 I wish I could say, oh boy, we discovered this and this is just fantastic. Um, I think it, it's more continually verifying that which we're observing and expanding it a bit more. Okay. Uh, I think, gosh, maybe the closest thing to at least a verification of things that a novel verification of things that people had thought about was this study that Dolph led. Gosh, it's now 30 years ago that it was published, 1994. Where actually Kelvin Lim again went around and was able to get some, at that time, magnetic tapes of MRI from local hospitals of people who were deemed normal. Okay? But we wanted to get it from age about 0 through the whole age range to see if we could really quantify fluid gray and white matter volumes over time. Now, of course, this is cross-sectional, but it was really the first study that went from 3 months to like age 75. And so we could, with the quantitation that Dolph and Kelvin did, with these brains that Kelvin was, these magnetic tapes that Kelvin was able to get of the MRI, to model and to actually quantify, it was beyond modeling, the growth of gray matter and the growth of white matter in the children from ages 3 months to about 10 plus years, and then to show the decline thereafter, okay, of gray matter with a kind of a continual increase in the white matter. So, and at the same time, the head was growing until about age 12, so that you could see that there's this growth of the intracranial volume, and that was being pushed mostly by the white matter, but also somewhat by the gray matter, even though it then started to decline. So these data, these quantitative volumetric data of the brain coalesced with what people like Erwin Feinberg was finding in sleep physiology, of this growth of this change in delta wave up to about age 10 or so, with a decline thereafter. And it might have been following the increase in gray matter, which later Ian Coleraine saw was correlated with the gray matter was correlated with delta waves and K complexes with sleep, that they all kind of conformed with this growth and then decline of gray matter, which may be a sign of pruning, which is a maturational um, effect. So that was really cool. And it still stands out as being a driving force in what we really do and understand about the brain.
Yeah.
So I can't say eureka, but I can say, oh, wow.
Yeah. Work with an impact.
Yeah.
The alcohol research field is very interactive and networked now and historically. And what you've talked about Dolph. Are there other people that you consider to have had an important impact on your work and other work in the alcohol field? That's a very broad question.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Oh, sure. And that's where RSA comes in for sure. From the neuropsychological perspective, one of the people who was highly influential to me and really super supportive was I call him my who's a godfather, okay, of, of of my progress, was Nelson Butters. And Nelson Butters had been, just a principal of neuropsychology at the Boston VA, and then he moved to San Diego, and actually and he ultimately died of ALS, which was just a tragedy, travesty. But even even when he was really disabled with ALS, he could use his thumb to use the computer for conversation. Okay, and I talked with him a couple of times, actually, through this method, just months before he died, and he still maintained this wonderful humor and this great support of me. And I will always treasure that. I will just treasure that, and it encouraged me in the alcohol field too. Don't be discouraged by those neurologists who think that they've solved everything. Yeah.
What would you like to see? What would you like to see in the future of alcohol research, and what do you expect to see?
Well, I think that it's sort of uh, as a model, we're all doing multimodal, multi-leveled analysis and data collection from different types of MRI to neuropsychology to genetics to social understanding and environmental, considering environmental influences. So we were doing this multi-level analysis. That multi-level analysis brings together people with different backgrounds and different areas of expertise. Alcohol can't be solved from one perspective. It's not simply a genetic disease. It's not simply an environmental disease. It's not simply a brain disease. It's everything. And it is heterogeneous. And so you need to have all of these different people and parts moving together, okay, and acting together. So considering that, we need a lot of different expertise, and we need to have then another layer of something like machine learning or artificial intelligence to pull a lot of these bits and pieces together. And then we also need to have the clinicians and the sociologists who say, stop, that's a silly outcome. Let's check it out to make sure that it's accurate. Just because you put all of this the data into the wearing blender of an AI machine learning algorithm doesn't mean you're going to come out with something that's useful, sensible, or even accurate. Okay. So we need to have the multi-level, I think, to pull all of these components together. And then we also have to look at the outcome in a sensible and responsible way, but not in a narrowed way. Because after all, if machine learning is going to tell us something novel, then we're going to have to try to appreciate that. Not that we have to accept it as being, the ground truth, but we have to then it should lead us to do a proper experiment. Okay, it should narrow what we have to do, even with with a randomized clinical trial. So that my hope is that we can get more people together to address this complex question of alcohol use disorder, how we can avoid it, how we can reduce the problem and reduce the angst and the trauma that comes with it.
So I have a colleague at Yale, Bubu Bani, who is studying the efficacy of team clinical services on treatment of alcohol use disorder. When I listen to you, I think, oh, maybe we need a team approach for the science
Mm-hmm.
of alcohol use disorder. I think it's what you've described.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting idea and useful. I also like what you had to say about AI. It has a role, and we need to interact with it. We need to supervise it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For researchers at the start of their career, do you have any advice to offer? Or early in their career?
Yeah. Okay. So it depends on where they are. If they're if they're postdoctoral fellows, they're ones that I might most likely run into. Okay. So if you're a postdoctoral fellow, you've already gone through a lot. You're already kind of forming yourself and your ideas. I think it's important to be both focused on addressing a problem and getting your publications out and getting grant applications out and whatever, but also be open enough to embrace new areas of quantitative, um, just quantitative methods, okay, as well as um, clinical, uh, the clinical outcome measures, and it depends on where you are, but I, if you're in something like alcohol use disorder research, Then you gotta be familiar, I think, with all of the different uh, factors and just the different factors that go into alcohol use disorder. Because if you put, not that you have to study them all, but you have to be aware of them. Um, and okay, so the problem is that there's a double-edged sword. You want to be aware of all of these different factors that go into alcohol use disorder, making somebody an alcohol user, an abuser. Okay, but you also have to focus on something in order for you to be successful in your career. So the double-edged sword is when you go and you write that first grant application, you can't have 50 million variables in there that cover the whole gamut of alcohol use disorder, but you do have to focus on a few and then try and put them into a broader context or a responsible context. I don't know. I think, people have to learn how to write, they have to learn how to think, they have to be aware of what's out there. Also, I think, just getting back to something I said earlier, that if you're going to use, MRI of any flavor as your tool, as your basic tool, you better understand what an image is. You better understand what goes into that pixel, never mind even the voxel. Okay, and the more you understand about that and the protocols that you're using, the more you're going to understand the scope and limit of what those data are going to tell you and what they can tell you. Um, it, that's all I can say. The same thing goes for the statistics that you're using. Make sure that you understand, what they really mean.
So, would you describe your thoughts about mentorship? If you have a philosophy of mentorship?
Yeah, get the work done. you know, when people come to the lab, and those people that I have mentored, what I have them do is the following: they have to write a 1-page, and it can't be a 1+ page. It has to be simply a 1-page specific aims of what they think they want to do over the next 2 years. Okay, and it has to be in the form of an NIH grant application specific aims. You give the background, the reasons why this is important, and upwards of 3 hypotheses to be tested. And then my hope is that by the end of the 2 years, they'll get at least one of those hypotheses tested and discovered and written up and published. Okay. Also, when a postdoc comes into the lab, in addition to that they've got, I think of it as a trident. Their work is a trident. They have 3 chances, or they get 3 strikes, okay, at being successful as a postdoc. First of all, is to try and do at least one of those hypotheses, that complete one of those studies that they're proposing. Number 2, meet other people in the laboratory and help them collect some data towards their discoveries, and that you can become an author on that too. And number 3, rummage around in the laboratory and see what data that we have available that hasn't been written up, and go and write it up. Okay, go analyze it and write it up. So you got 3 strikes, okay, 3 chances to have publications. So if your experiment fails, you're not going to fail as a postdoctoral fellow. Okay? And as it's happened, I think the postdocs from our lab have done very well on the publication front. And this way, it also broadens their horizon so that they're not just honed in on their own work, but they can see other people's work and maybe even put their work into their context. And you can have pairs of people working together. That, they should be self-selecting. I don't like to push people together. But when people are done, remember, clinical work takes a long time, clinical research. So this is one way to expedite their work. And I think it works pretty well.
That's a very practical view. I'm actually going to take some of your guidance.
Okay.
For researchers in general, do you have anything you'd like to ask of us?
I'm not sure that I understand that question.
Let me see. Is there something that, or is there anything that you think that we could be doing that enhances aspects of alcohol research? It could be along the line of training, could be experimental directions, it could be ways of working together.
Yeah. Well, one thing I think of, I actually think about what George Koob has done as the director of NIAAA. That one of his, to me, biggest contributions is to create the website. And there had been a website, but I mean, he's just expanded that website into a perfectly useful, just commodity in a sense for understanding alcohol, and it is a living body of information. They keep changing it, they keep updating it. And when I say changing it, I mean updating it and even correcting it if there are errors in it. They're highly responsive to that. And the information that's out there about alcohol use disorder, spans from the from middle school right into the dementia ages. And it cross cuts, real diversity, concepts, and it includes human and animal research and genetics research. And the epidemiology there is really important. The thing that I think that website does is to bring the alcohol, is to unify the alcohol community, number one, and as importantly, to show what's been done, because I think sometimes we forget what we already know, and puts it forth in a way that it can be communicated to the rest of the world. Okay? Because after all, if we don't disseminate the information in a way that's digestible to the public, then it's useless. It's useless with respect to one of the missions of the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. And so, that's our responsibility to get the information out. And that's really hard. That's a hard thing to do.
For members of the public who may watch this video, is there anything that you'd like to say straight to them?
We want to help people who need help, and we want to hear from the community to find out what we're missing. And I'd really like to make sure that my feeling is that we probably most of us know somebody who has an alcohol use disorder. It could be highly severe, and it could be modest, it could be minimal. But I think that we have to be aware of the signs of it. We have to be knowledgeable in how to deal with it, because it doesn't work to just say to somebody who has a severe alcohol use disorder, stop drinking. Well, yeah, that doesn't do anything except to put you in danger of getting hit. Okay, but the more you know about the disease and the disorder, the more you might be able to enable that person to find some recovery, to stop drinking at an irresponsible and an unhealthy level. I think that the the public at large, that we should equip the public at large with information and methods to help each other. Right. And actually, one of the things that George Kuba has done with the NIAAA is to have the treatment navigator. So if you got a problem, and you live in area code 55555, you can dial that in and you can find help in that area. And sometimes that's what a spouse might need. I don't even know where to turn, because the primary care physician is too scared to bring this up with my husband, and so you have to try and help yourself too, but you have to be given the tools to do that.
Thank you, Dr. Sullivan. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us today.
Graeme, thank you. Yeah, let me just say it's a real honor for me to be asked alongside with all of these other principles of the Research Society of Alcohol, and I'm honored by that.
So I will. Well, I'll stop the recording there, and then you want to take a little time and talk about TK?
Sure. Yeah, and sure.
Because this will be a separate thing.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Uh,
So there, and we can do it. I have 3 questions.
Mhm.
Do whatever you'd like. I'm just going to ask how you came to know TK, if there are any interesting moments with him you'd like to share, and how he affected your perspectives on alcohol and research. So you can see, how did you come to know TK?
How did I come to know TK? Well, through obviously through RSA, and he, and I met TK shortly before he became the director of the NIAAA, and he, gosh, he, one of the, I can't remember the first time I met TK, but I can remember many other instances and interchanges with him. I mean, Dolph probably pointed out that we have 2 publications with TK. They were our first rat imaging studies, and I had the privilege of being the first author on the first one, and that was the normal aging of the rat. And the second one, Dolph was the first author on, and it was the effects of alcohol on the brain of the rat over time. Okay, and TK took each of those papers and wrote very carefully and edited them beautifully. And as Dolph always pointed out in his absolutely beautiful handwriting, um, uh, what what was wrong, how it could be improved, improve the writing, and just our thinking and understanding of the rat model as a model of alcohol use disorder. So that was a real practical piece of it. Another practical thing and an event that was just unique. We were the luckiest people in the world that I think there were 15 of us that TK had invited. This was when he was the director, invited us to China. And we had several meetings and we gave talks in China to, disseminate information and have an information exchange on alcohol use disorder. So that was interesting. And then he said, actually, dolphin me up with guides, okay, to be guided around because you certainly can't go around China by yourself very well. We ended up also, we were in both Beijing and in Shanghai, and we had meetings in both places. And that it was a unique experience to be done with this bowl box of people, as we traveled around. Fantastic. And then later on, I'll just mention this one other thing. Later on, when TK started to show the signs of Parkinson's disease and some instability of walking and the like, and I was doing. He knew that I was doing work in with the balance platform and with ataxia, in alcoholics in recovery, and he'd call me up and say, "Now, like, what should I do here? I think I've read that you have to be careful with your eyes open or eyes closed." So I would tell him things that he could do in the house that could make his walking safer. And when I visited him in his house, every single one of those pieces that I mentioned were done, from having handles that were put on the doors to the walls to removing rugs that were not, stationary, and to making sure that everything that I mentioned was followed. Okay, he was the best student in the world, and he was the kindest and most thoughtful, and 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 appropriately aggressively pushing to make sure that you actually did something. You got this out. When he thought that something was important, he wanted to make sure that you pursued it and got it out. And so that, I mean, I will never forget that, that push that he'd give, and his kindness along with.
How does he push in a kind way?
Well, first of all, when you get a telephone call from the director of the NIAAA, you have a heart attack. That's the very first thing. Takes your breath away. So that alone, the power of the office is real. And so when somebody like TK calls up and you listen, after you catch your breath and your wits, and you listen really intently, he'll tell you something. He would tell you something about the importance of what you're doing and the ramifications if you didn't do it. Okay? Full stop. Yeah.
That's clarity. I mean, were there ways that TK affected your perspectives on alcohol and on research?
I'm sure that there were. I don't know that I can identify anything anything in particular. Okay, other than in addition to really teaching us more about what an animal model was and what it isn't. And that alone, I think, that was a principle to learn.
That is very important. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Oh, I don't know. I guess I'm a lucky person that I met TK and his family. And to this day, like about 3 weeks ago, Dolph and I were visiting Duke. And when we're in the Duke area, we always see Susan Lee. And we had a beautiful evening with her. And just a couple of evenings ago, we met Susan and TK's grandson, Teddy, who is a burgeoning scientist, and he's at the intramural program at NIAAA, and a chip off the old block.
So TK, it's clear, has had a broad and lasting influence on people and on the alcohol community.
Totally. Oh, I'm going to give you one more example of his kindness and his thoughtfulness. Years ago, I was on, he invited me to be on the editorial board for the, alcohol, at that time it was called Alcohol World, and it was, the review journal of NIAAA. It's now called, like, I don't know, current research and whatever. So the first meeting was on a Monday. And in order to get to Washington on a Monday from California, you have to leave on Sunday. He was appalled that we should never have a meeting. And they'd always had the meetings on Mondays. We should never have a meeting on Monday for people. That means they can't be with their families on Sunday. We're going to meet now on Tuesdays. And thereafter, it was a Tuesday meeting. Okay. So he was, and he was the, NIAAA director. He worked all the time. But this was just an unnecessary burden on the people he had requested to come. Now, I was super lucky because TK and Susan often would invite me over for dinner. That you can't eat alone, he would say. I don't like to have you eat alone, so you have to eat with us. And then not only that, but then Susan would pack me up with the lunch to take on the plane for my ride home. So this was a very, very special relationship that we had. But it showed his sense of family and his understanding of what people go through in order to serve the Institute. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Sullivan.
Thank you, Graeme.